So I'm Virginia Black, of course, and I'm currently teaching while running my practice, F Architecture. So today you'll see one of the outcomes of F Architecture's collaboration with Amu Pakin, alongside more independent work that I've done with them. So before founding my practice, I studied Spanish and Kichwa, which is a language spoken in Ecuador. It's part of Quechua, which is the broader language family spoken in the Andean region. And I studied at the Andes and Amazon Field School in Napo, Ecuador, over several summers. So the majority of the work that I'm presenting today stems from that research and its resulting relationships, which include my relationship with Amu Pakin, as you described earlier. It's a Quechua women's midwifery and cultural center that's located in Archidona, Ecuador. And so you can see it there with the X. And then also collaborations with anthropologist Georgia Innes, and there she is speaking with Adela, who is the 2016 president of Amu Pakin. So while there, I spent time in the chagra. It's a kind of garden that's planted with subsistence crops and that also supports practices of memory. And it's also a space that is traditionally occupied and cultivated by women. So during the time I was there, at first, I was learning about it from a linguistic and anthropological frame, but I was also thinking about how the space might be communicated as a space of memory through architectural drawing conventions. And particularly for Amu Pakin, who are in the business of translating cultural knowledge of the rainforest to visitors staying at their center, I wondered what kinds of representation might support these broader acts of translation and communication. And then briefly, I just wanted to touch on the recent demonstrations and thinking about political demonstrations in Ecuador. So this exercise of studying the chagra was part and parcel with understanding broader forces that shape rural and urban livelihoods in Ecuador. Thinking of architecture as a cultural technology, and asking how do Amazonian space-making practices, such as those enacted by the women of Amu Pakin in the chagra, support and create the particular strength of indigenous movements in Ecuador, which are some of the strongest in the world, and particularly in the 90s were incredibly strong. And I also conducted some interviews during the protests in 2015, from which I made a documentary. And one of those interviews with Kari Betancourt, who's the director of Women and Families in CONAI, the Confederation of Indigenous Peoples of Ecuador. And in this conversation, she makes explicit rejections of capitalist feminism in response to the government's proposed deals with massive corporations like Coca-Cola and extractive industries like Petroamazonas. And she's asking why the government doesn't preoccupy itself with supporting the campo, with agriculture, and with the chagras as existing economic spaces. And then more from the protest in 2015. There was a massive march there that was over 500 miles that started in the south of the country. And so indigenous peoples were walking, fed by food from the campo, from chagras, as they marched to defend the Ecuadorian constitution. And they were focused on the defense of pluri-sovereignty and of the rights of nature, which they helped to create. So the march becomes not only a representation of this desired pluri-sovereignty, but also an act of statecraft that's supported by the chagras that constitute a part of the territory of the march. So today I'm going to present two projects, iyarisha chagrai, which is Kichwa for in the garden I may remember, and then also an active designed protest. So iyarisha chagrai uses hypermedia representation to situate women's rituals of knowledge production within the field of architecture and design. And by drawing relationships between women, plants, time, and memory, this documentation methodology assists in building literacy toward interpretations of the rainforest as a cultural and historic landscape, revisioning Western concepts of the Ecuadorian Amazon as a constructed space rather than a homogeneous, self-determined, and unintervened entity. So this project also centers cultivating labors of Kichwa women as designed action, ritual practice, and as cross-species collaboration toward reflection and memory. So chagras exist within Kichwa and Quechua communities, particularly in the highlands of Ecuador, in the Andean mountain range, But this project is situated within the Amazonian region at the edge of the rainforest, where lumu or manioc tuber is the primary crop that's grown, and where chagras share borders with less cultivated forest space. So in the chagra, women interact with birds, plants, and other living beings through song, and many of the plants grown there are cultivated to attract particular species whose presence invokes songs of memory. And the songs frequently relate memories of their mothers and women ancestors, while the aesthetic quality of the songs and the skills and emotional power required to conjure them reflect and engenders a particular strength particular to Amazonian womanhood. And this strength is possessed by a sinchiwarmi, or a strong woman. So this is a Kichwa term, and it's a self-designated phrase that Kichwa women use to describe and declare their power. This is something that linguist Janice Knuckles writes about, as exemplified by Luisa Cadena and Estela Dawa, among others. And she states, "The strong woman is not simply strong in the physical sense or stoically able to endure crushing emotional blows. Rather, the strong woman is someone who conceives of herself as having an abundance of inner power as well as physical strength to change aspects of life that are not satisfactory." The critical point here is that she sees herself as an active force in her own destiny and exercises her agency. So this strength is also embodied by Delicia Dawa, and this is a clip from a video of her that Todd Swanson recorded where she's singing about orphan cotinga birds. So when she sees the cotinga bird again in the forest, Delicia draws parallels between the loss of her mother and the bird's loss of their mother species, singing the song of her mother, who sang the songs of her mother, who once grew special plants to attract these toucans and toucanettes to her garden. So there's a high-pitched quality of this song which mimics the sounds of birds, and it's fashioned to cut through the thick forest. And mimicry alone is not the measure of a beautiful song, nor the extent of its expressive potential. Women typically cry while singing, a practice that invites listeners to cross an emotional boundary that separates individuals, both human and non-human. So being able to cry and laugh beautifully are reflective of an ability to be Sunshiwarmi, to remember the strength of female ancestors in a way that's explicitly and powerfully emotional, fortifying a kind of matriarchal history. And then the laughter at the end of the song is also highly attuned, and the beauty is judged amongst women. So this act of singing is a process of memorialization supported by a crafted external worlds, a designed environment diffuse with the possibility of attracting other beings who prompt memorial practices and rituals. While the Cotinga bird appears in a manner that is not entirely predictable, it is this spontaneity that opens the chagra to experiences that are not always directly instrumental, nor are their meanings foreclosed. Implicit in the disappearance of the Cotinga bird's mother species is the contingency of memory itself, its dependence upon others, upon its externalization and supplementation. So viewing the garden as a site of memory, even as it elides monumental forms with which we are familiar, allows us to consider how it might be read, understood, valued, and perpetuated, even as its forms continually transmute. So I wanted to go into the documentation, so I'll review three drawings that I've made. And I wanted to discuss this act of transmutation a bit further and to move into the series of drawings. So this explores the relationship between subjectivity and space making, where conceptual and physical territories are established by human and non-human interaction and ritual. So moving from the body at the center of the drawing, and human subjectivity is the point of reference with which we're most familiar, outward demonstrates the ways that practicing various rituals results in the transmutation of human beings into other forms of life, forms which also see themselves as human. So actions like muskuna, dreaming that allows another soul to enter, machachina, drinking ayahuasca to obtain insight, and takina, sinking to chant oneself into the sky, conditioned states of mind that allow territorial transitions and illustrates the flexibility of the interspecies barriers. So this flexibility is described by many anthropologists as a kind of intertextuality of landscapes, bodies, and society. And all entities within this forest have a unique subjectivity alongside unique practices that shape their way of being in the world. So while humans cannot understand these ways of beings of others entirely, they can access them partially through these rituals. And this access can be beneficial, from using plants as food or medicine to accessing insider knowledge of what family members are doing, or to acquiring spiritual knowledge corresponding with the nature of being. But it can also be problematic, as one's humanness can be left behind, and I'll share an example of that. So as Brazilian anthropologist Eduardo Viveiros de Castro notes, traditional Western epistemologies of nature and culture break down in what he terms Amerindian cosmology. So there, the soul is the universal concept rather than the white male body, and all living entities, including plants and animals, have souls that presuppose these bodies. So each soul is actively constructing a self through his or her body, and has the subjectivity that can be seen from only within that position. And various selves and multiplicitous cultures are created through the practices of these bodies, including eating, drinking, and creating shelter. And neglecting to follow those practices can cause a transmutation. So as animals, plants, and humans craft an active landscape, this means the self, nature, and culture are constantly shifting and reforming. And the Kichwa word runa illustrates this concept. So runa roughly means one who has a soul or a being with personhood. While Kichwa people refer to themselves as runa, they may also refer to other plants or animal species with the denotation runa, indicating that they too have a soul and a culture. So for example, in referencing a jaguar, they may say puma runa, or a jaguar person. So plants as well as animals can be referred to as this. And because the self is continuously constructed through this interspecies cultivation, there is a constant possibility that one may transcend the species barrier and take on other bodily forms. So this concept is the focus of many species origin stories that also serve as precautionary tales. So this shows this reshaping, and the body, the skin that one wears, can be seen as a kind of crafted surface capable of signifying one's past acts, engendering and prompting the memory of others. So I wanted to visit this act of tekina, which means to sing, but it also connotes the transference of power from one entity to another. And this power is transferred as samai, or a power of the breath, which is sent out to the bird, calling for a transference of ushai, the power of the bird, which becomes a kind of corporal power expressed in the body of the singer. So the strength of the samai, or the power of the breath, is created through the quality of the formal aesthetics of the song, and by mimicking the patterns and flights of birds, ascension and descension, as anthropologist Michael Tasig notes, and I quote, "She chants herself into the scene. She exists not as a subject, but as another. She creates the bridge between the original and copy that brings a new force to intervene in the human worlds." And then Michael Uzendowski and Edith Kalapucha call this form of mimesis somatic poetry, or the writing of oneself into the landscape or into the body of another via ritual action. This shamanic power becomes the basis from which feminine and masculine power are derived. But again, the chagra, these are highly gendered spaces. So women may generally communicate to different species than men through song, but they still access the most powerful entities in the forest, and along with them, significant spiritual healing and practical knowledge. Okay, so I just wanted to move to Lumu, and these are the kinds of stories and information that I was representing while working with Amupakin. So the care and propagation of manioc plants, which are seen as children developing in parallel to the woman's body, is a part of memory practice that affirms the chagra as this kind of landscape. So in order to grow lumu, then women have to follow, or they observe, ritual practices known as sasino, or abstaining. And within the chagra, lumu plants are considered children who must be tended to. So lumu is said to have originated after a lazy mother left her child in the chagra overnight and returned to find that she had transformed into a lumu plant. So because the child was vulnerable, she was seduced to see herself from the subjectivity of the lumu, and thus her body transformed into that of a plant. So as manioc plants are considered as children, women also observe sasinas or restrictions that correspond to the women's of their body as they're in pregnancy or menstruation. So there's a kind of shared body relationship between plants and the women in the garden that exists. So then moving forward, I wanted to look at this drawing, the axis mundi. So seeing the ways that the chagra is crafted and the ways that it's developed into forest. So these were made with amapakin, so you can see them. They're planting within the chagra, and then when the chagra is used and they're ready to move to another place, they start to plant certain plants there in order to transform it into sacha, and then that transforms into ruku sacha, which is the old forest. So this is revealing the ways that the design of the chagra actually transforms the rainforest itself, and then over centuries you can imagine how that transformation affects the entire rainforest. And then just moving into this final drawing, I wanted to show some of these drawings done by Amu Pakin. And I was thinking about how these forms of subjectivity could be integrated into the Ethnobotanical Encyclopedia, which is a site that attempts to combine indigenous knowledge with scientific knowledge of how to maintain plants. So this is a drawing of Sikta done by Cleofe Salazar. So the Ethnobotanical Dictionary traditionally doesn't include space-making practices. It just takes small portions of plants following botanical illustration methods. I wanted to integrate these ways of clearing the forest, ways of planting, and then notes on these practices, so that it could be understood in a more holistic way. So there are several of these drawings that I constructed, and then there were little sound clips here where you could click and hear women speaking about the plants, and they were translated into English, Spanish, and Kichwa. So I'm about to end, but I just wanted to briefly talk about this act of designed protest, or this demonstration that we did with Amu Pakin. So thinking about the ways that these practices, ways of occupying space, have not been honored by the development practices of the Ecuadorian government, and thinking about how, for example, homes were delivered to Kichwa people without asking them what kinds of environments they actually want to live in or how they use the land. When UN Habitat 3 came to Quito, we thought it would be a really good opportunity for Amu Pakin to speak about these practices, and we applied to exhibit within that space and to allow them to share their cultural knowledge. But the price point was so extraordinarily prohibitive that we weren't actually able to pay for them to exhibit. So we wanted to design presence in other ways and to think about how this could be demonstrated. So this is showing this cleansing ritual that Amu Pakin performed in front of the Habitat exhibition. And you can see these cameras where they were actually interviewed by local news. So they were using this in somewhat of a spectacular way, intentionally mobilizing it to have their message heard. And then when it was played on the local news, they edited all the Kichwa out, and they just like chopped a Spanish voice over their voices. So I think that this really demonstrates the kind of difficulty of presencing this knowledge within public forums, and also the problematics of essentializing one's identity and trying to be seen within this space. So here are some more images from that. In conclusion, I wanted to ask, how does memorialization, itself a term reliant upon practice, or what does memorialization give us? So memory is not just a matter of mind, either confined to the body or possessed by material forms ready to be encountered. Rather, it's reliant upon practices of engagement with others and with otherness. It's reliant upon interpretation, which is specific to individual experience. Memorialization as an ideal process facilitated by the traditional monument supports collective memory, creating community from those with shared concerns, identity, trauma. But memorialization also exists in its enactment between beings. In this case, the chagra is created via interactions between runa. So, from this understanding, the destruction of the rainforest is an act of ecocide, but it's also an act of ethnocide and genocide, a destruction of culture and a destruction of the runa that maintain it, create it, and live it. So, any strategy that aims to conserve the rainforest as a space of memory cannot merely preserve a parcel of land upon which people, animals, and plants within it exist as merely representational or symbolic forms. While portions of the rainforest may be preserved by UNESCO, for example, under its New World Heritage Landscapes program, the aim to preserve it as a space of memory for humans, even indigenous people in particular, is misaligned from the perspective of this cosmology. So the rainforest itself and its methods of preservation cannot be fully understood until the non-humans on the site are thought as runa, and their inclusion within landscapes of memory ceases to be abstracted from intergenerational memories and personal cultivation until it is unsevered from the perspective of individuals with whom it's crafted.